I'm here with Professor Ron Metoyer from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at Notre Dame, who also serves as the Engineering College's Associate Dean for Diversity and Faculty Development. Thanks for joining me today, Ron.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Ron, you've focused your career over the past several years on issues in diversity and equity within computer science. This is an amazing initiative and something really, really important for the field at large. And I have some questions related to this that I'd like to chat with you about.
Mhm.
First, why don't we see more women and people of color within computing? When you look at the numbers, these groups are vastly underrepresented.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that would take a lot more time than we have today to answer completely. But the general idea is that there are a number of issues. There's image, access, and retention issues. So first, we all know the stereotype of the computer scientist, right? The nerd who sits in a corner and codes all day while eating Cheetos and drinking soda. That simply isn't appealing to many students. But I believe we're making good strides in changing the stereotypical view. More importantly, students of color generally do not have the same access to computing in the K through 12 levels that many other students in the US have. This is, of course, due to racist policies that date back many years and that have resulted in people of color not having access to equitable education, where, for example, they can be exposed to computing classes. There are also often other unintentional barriers. For example, enrollment caps in computing courses due to the high number of interested students or challenges to transferring from other majors make it difficult for students from these groups who may not discover computing until they get to college to actually then transfer into the major. We also lose many women from the STEM fields in K through 12. This is due to many issues that also affect students of color, including a lack of identity with STEM. They just don't see themselves as being a scientist or a computer scientist. Why? Because the majority of people in those fields don't look like them. They're typically white males, so unless one is a white male, it's hard to identify with computing and see yourself in that field. And finally, there are simply culture and climate issues that affect retention. If a person doesn't feel welcome in a community or feels isolated, then it becomes difficult to retain that person in the field. We've seen tech companies struggle with this issue for a number of years. So those are just a few of the factors contributing to underrepresentation of women and people of color.
What steps should educators like you and me be taking to make our classrooms and laboratories more inclusive?
So I love this question. One of the things I think is incredibly easy and important to do is simply to try to make our classrooms and research labs more inclusive. So, for example, when I put together a syllabus for my class and I'm scheduling guest speakers, I intentionally make sure that I schedule scholars who are women and/or people of color. In doing so, I've taken a step toward building identity in my students from these particular groups. I also pay attention to the readings I assign, and I make sure I'm featuring diverse authors, again, trying to address identity issues. In my human-computer interaction course, we also cover several topics that relate to diversity and inclusive design. We read papers on accessible technology for people with disabilities and on designing technology for marginalized populations. These topics tend to be particularly interesting to students who may fall into any of these categories, and they get all of our students to think more broadly about how their work as computer scientists can impact diverse groups. I believe this kind of focus also begins to change the hyper-masculine, tech-oriented view of computing to a more human-centric view that can generalize the appeal of computing. Finally, I think it's important as educators to build diverse research teams and foster inclusive and equitable labs and classrooms in general.
How about hiring in industry? What should companies be thinking about when it comes to building a more diverse and vibrant workforce?
So that's a tough question. While I don't have much experience with tech companies, I believe their issues are similar to those we have in academia. I think we all need to be more intentional about recruiting. We need to identify promising, diverse candidates and establish relationships with them. And it has to be genuine. If we want to recruit women and people of color, for example, to Notre Dame Computer Science and Engineering, or to Google or to Facebook, then we need to ensure and demonstrate that these are inclusive places. That means we need to have clear values and goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that we need to follow through on those. When an organization values diversity, equity, and inclusion, it shows in its culture and in its working climate. When the culture values diverse voices and the resulting climate is one that women and people of color enjoy working in and are empowered in, then I think you're going to see progress. And of course, we all need to do whatever is possible to address the K through 12 pipeline issues. And that starts with working for equitable access to quality education for all.
We have a lot of work ahead of us, Ron, but it's definitely going to be worth it. Thank you again for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.